नमो तस् भगवतो अरहतो सम्मा सम्बुद्धस्स। नमो तस् भगवतो अरहतो सम्मा सम्बुद्धस्स। नमो तस् भगवतो अरहतो सम्मा सम्बुद्धस्स. So today we continue to study the part 2 of the book 5 of the Buddha and his Dhamma, and the subpart 2 of the part 2 of the book 5 of the Buddha and his Dhamma is titled as the Bhikkhu and the Ascetic. So in the subsequent subparts, Baba Ambedkar has given the comparison of the Bhikkhu with the ascetic, and then with the brahmin, and with the Upasaka. So these three subparts, they combine together the ideal of Bhikkhu vis-a-vis the certain prevalent comparable identities. So Dr. Baba Ambedkar begins this subpart 2, which is titled as the Bhikkhu and the Ascetic, by raising a question, and that question is the Bhikkhu an ascetic? And the answer is in the negative. So we know that in the first sermon of the Buddha made it clear that his teaching is not that of the self mortification, or what is known as the asceticism, and neither his teaching is about what is called the indulgence, sensual indulgence, and the Buddha taught the middle path. So to make it clear that a bhikkhu is not an ascetic, Baba Ambedkar has included Buddha's discussion with the wanderer Nigrodh. Nigrodh was an ascetic, and he had a lot of followers who were also ascetics, and they were living in Rajagraha. And the setting of the discussion is described by Baba Ambedkar in the beginning verses, and then the Buddha enters into discussion with Nigrodh. So the ascetic Nigrodh asks the Buddha the question about his Dhamma, because the Buddha's popularity is so well known all over the places that a lot of people came to Buddha to question the Buddha, to seek answers for certain questions that they had on their minds. And Nigrodh does the same. He asks the Buddha the questions. And the question asked by Nigrodh to the Buddha is, what, Lord, is this religion of the Exalted One? What is the religion of the Buddha? What is it that the Buddha teaches? Wherein he trains his disciples, and which those disciples, so trained by the Exalted One as to win comfort, acknowledge to be their utmost support and the fundamental principles of righteousness. So these are the few questions by which the Nigrodha begins to probe the Buddha. And we have seen that all over the places, the Buddha is being questioned, Buddha is being asked certain doubts about what constitutes his Dhamma. And this exchange between the Nigrodha and the Buddha is the same. And many of the Pali Sutras actually begins with what is called the questioning the Buddha. Of course, there is one book also titled as Questioning the Buddha. And many of the suttas of the Buddha began with the questions being posed to the Buddha. So the Buddha's answer is very clear. And the verse number 8 summarizes the Buddha's general attitude towards teaching the people. So the Buddha begins saying that difficult it is Nigrod for one of another view, of another persuasion, of another confession, without practice and without teaching. You see, these two words are very important. To understand something of Buddhism, one should involve in some practice of Buddhism and learn something about Buddhism. So this particular answer of the Buddha is very meticulous in a sense of understanding that how does one understand the Buddha's Dhamma? One understands the Buddha's Dhamma by some practice and by learning something about the Buddha Dhamma. So the second part is obvious, but the practice part is very important. So if we want to understand the Buddha's Dhamma, it's very important for us to take up some kind of the Buddhist practices, the practice of Sila, Samadhi, and Prajna. So the Buddha poses a difficulty, saying that it's not easy, it's difficult for one of another view. If you are coming with highly loaded views about certain things, then it's very difficult to teach that person, explain that person what is the Dhamma. If somebody is already persuaded by some kind of the belief system or some kind of a doctrine, it's not easy to, Buddha is not saying that it's impossible. Buddha says it's not easy to teach them of another confession. So see, people always come with a lot of ideas in their minds, a lot of views about certain things, and it's very difficult for them to understand the Buddha's Dhamma or the fundamental principles of righteousness. So therein the Buddha talks about that without practice and without teaching to understand that wherein I train my disciples, and of which they so trained as to win comfort, acknowledged to be their utmost support and the fundamental principle of righteousness. See, the Buddha is saying that it's not difficult for him to teach in the verse number 9. And the Buddha's teaching method, and I think this teaching method we can apply in any discipline, is very, very interesting. So in the verse number 9, the Buddha says, ask me, Nigrod, a question about your own doctrine, about austere scrupulousness of life. In what does the fulfillment, in what does the non-fulfillment of this self-mortification consist? So the Buddha is a very interesting teacher. And Buddha is a teacher for excellence, as we have seen in the various passages of the suttas. So the Buddha says, okay, it might become a little bit difficult for me to teach you the Dhamma, because you come from a different religious tradition, you come from a different confession, you come from different persuasion, but maybe it's not, you can question about your own doctrine. So you tell me what do you think about all this righteousness and all about the question that you asked. What constitute your Dhamma? What constitutes your Dharma? That's what the Buddha asked to Nigrod. And then Nigrod goes on explaining his philosophies, his teachings about self-mortifying austerities, and what is important in the practices of asceticism. So most of the times when we are teaching the Buddha Dhamma, it's just one way. We think that we can just teach the Dhamma to other people just like that. But as we have seen from the sutta, that it doesn't happen like that. The Buddha is very particular to know what the other person is thinking, what is their belief system, what is their, in which school of thought they are brought up. In other words, the Buddha would like to know the background of the people with whom he is interacting. He's trying to gauge their belief system, understand their belief system. So this method of engaging in dialogue with a person who is interested in knowing the Buddha's Dhamma, and the Buddha has a very beautiful way of teaching the people. He won't impose his ideas on the people. His goal is to clarify people's mind, not to add more baggage to the people's mind. And therefore, he has to know what content he's dealing with. And here, the Buddha is taking the similar attitude of knowing what belief system Nigrod follows. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to skip the entire page on what constitute the austerities. And we all know the self-mortification that we have seen in the previous classes. So Nigroth goes on defining, talking about his belief system, their practices, and so on and so forth. And after hearing this, the Buddha now puts a question. And the Buddha's format of teaching is question and answer. He goes on, question, answer, goes on clarifying. And we can say that, this is this method, which is now known as recursive argument method, where there is one topic of discussion and then they go on arguing recursively and they come to the final points. And, those final points are clarified and the conflict is resolved. So a lot of things begin with clarifying the things. And that's how the science begins, with recursive methods of argumentation. So here, now once Nigroth has made his position clear, the Buddha now asks the question. So he asks, now I, Nigroth, affirm that austerity by self-mortification thus carried out involves blemish in several ways. So the Buddha says that the practices that you are doing, the practices of self-mortification that you are doing, do they carry any blame? Do they carry any blame? That is the question asked by the Buddha to Nigroth. So Nigroth, questions back the Buddha, saying that, Lord, do you, he says, in what way, Lord, do you affirm that blemish is involved? And then the next verses go on explaining the various blames. And I'm going to look at some of the blames, even if you are indulging into the practices. This is applicable to all of us. Many of us, if we claim to practice something, we try to glorify those practices, saying that, they are the practices. But here, the Buddha is saying that there are, can there be any blemish in certain kind of practices? So in case, Nigroth, when an ascetic undertakes a course of austerity, he through that course becomes self-complacent. So is your practice of mortification, self-mortification or asceticism is leading you to self-complacence. His aim is satisfied. Now this Nigroth becomes a blemish in the ascetic. So anytime, any practice, if we follow the Buddha's advice here, makes you self-complacent, it makes you indifferent, then the Buddha says that we can blame it. It's very profound that anything that makes you self-complacent, that makes you indifferent to the woes of the world, then, it is, blameworthy. And then again, Nigroth, when an ascetic undertakes a course of austerity, he through that undertaking exalts himself and despises others. If the practice of the self-mortification makes you feel that you are above people and the other people are down, exalts himself and despises others, this too becomes a blemish in the ascetic. This is also blameworthy. That is what the Buddha says. And again, Nigroth, when an ascetic undertakes a course of austerity, he through that undertaking becomes inebriated and infatuated. If your practices are making you feel disoriented, infatuated, and you become careless, that too becomes a blemish in the ascetic. So whatever is Buddha telling to Nigroth, the ascetic, it's also applicable to all of the humanity, isn't it? And again, Nigroth, when an ascetic undertakes a course of austerity, it procures for him gifts, attention, and fame. Thereby, he becomes complacent and his aim is satisfied. This too becomes a blemish in the ascetic. You see, so if you are, getting attention, getting gifts, getting name and fame, and you become complacent with that, then that is also blameworthy. And again, Nigroth, by winning of gifts, attention, and fame, he becomes inebriated, infatuated, and grows careless. This too becomes a blemish in the ascetic. And again, Nigroth, When an ascetic undertakes a course of austerity, he comes to make a distinction in food, saying this food suits me, this food doesn't suit me. The latter kind he deliberately rejects. Over the former, he waxes greedy and infatuated and cleaves to them, seeing not the danger in them, discerning them not as unsafe, and so enjoys them. This too becomes a blemish in the ascetic. So this is also blameworthy. If one is trying to, distinct, make a distinction between food. This food is good, this food is bad, and so on. And again, Negro, because of his longing for gifts, attention, and fame, he thinks Rajas will pay me attention, and so will their officials. So too will nobles, Brahmins, householders, and founders of schools. This too becomes a blemish in ascetic. And again, Negro, then ascetic gets grumbling at some recluse or Brahmin, saying that man lives on all sorts of things. Things grow on tubers or shoots or berries or joints or fifthly from seeds, munching them all up together with that willless thunderbolt of a jawbone, and they call him a holy man. This too becomes a blemish in the ascetic. In other words, if a person is become jealous of other people's practices, then it's also blameworthy. And this goes on and on, and Buddha clarifies what can be the blameworthy. And in other words, the Buddha is teaching that how to live a blameless life. And even if one is practicing the worst kind of asceticism, self-mortification at the expense of their bodies and their minds, the Buddha is saying that that too can become blameworthy. And the Buddha is giving the various criteria by which we can say that they are not living the blameless life. Then after finishing all these descriptions of blames, the Buddha asks the question to Negro, do you approve of this? He, not approving, says, I do, or approving, I do not. Thus he consciously tells untruth, and this too. Okay, so what the Buddha is saying that, the Buddha is saying that if you are practicing asceticism and if you are, indulging into deliberate lies, then it's also blameworthy. And if, as I said, that the Buddha goes on describing, if the ascetic is hypocrite, is deceitful, and cunning, crafty, hard-hearted, and when he entertains evil wishes and becomes captive to them, he entertains false opinions, becomes possessed of meta-empirical dogma, misinterprets his experience, is avaricious and adverse from renunciation. This too becomes a blemish in the ascetic. So the list of blames that the Buddha has given to Nigrod here, it's not just for Nigrod, but we also need to contemplate them deeply. Whenever we indulge into any sort of the spiritual practices, we have to be on the guard, not to get infatuated, not to run after the name and fame, not to become competitive of the other people's practices or their achievements, and not to tell the deliberate lies, and not to entertain the false opinions, not to be possessed by the dogmas, not to be possessed by misinterpret one experience, because sometimes human mind is very complicated, and sometimes we experience certain things and we misinterpret them, and some people have some experiences, and they claim that they have seen the divine beings or gods or whatever. You see, the Buddha is saying that we should be very, very careful in interpreting our experiences. So you see, there are all blames that the Buddha has given, and then after enlisting all the blames, the Buddha asked the question back to Nigrod: what think of you of this, Nigrod? Are these things blemish in the austerities of self-mortifications, or are they not? Verily, Lord, these things are blemish in the austerities of self-mortification. It is possible, Lord, that an ascetic may be possessed even of all these blemishes, much more by one or other of them. The Buddha says, after hearing this, the bhikkhus are not to be guilty of these blemishes. So the bhikkhu is very different from the ascetic. And this subpart of the Buddha and his Dhamma makes it clear that the bhikkhu is not ascetic. And the bhikkhu being, is a representative of the Buddha's Sangha. It's also applicable to the Buddhist at large that, they should not be blameworthy. They should practice in such a way that, they should not exalt others. They should not exalt themselves and despise others. They should not, become self-complacent. The Buddhists are not supposed to be self-complacent. They are not supposed to exalt themselves and despite others. They are not supposed to be inebriated and infatuated and grow careless. They are not supposed to, crave for the gifts, attention and fame. They should not, try to win the attentions of the powerful people, and they should not become competitive with other people. They should not become jealous of the other people's gains. They should not tell the deliberate lies, and they should not lose their temper and bear enmity in their hearts. And they should not be hypocritical and deceitful, envious and grudging, cunning and crafty, hard-hearted and vain. They should not entertain evil wishes and become captive to them. They should not entertain false opinions. They should not be possessed by meta-empirical dogma. They should not misinterpret their experience, and they should not be full of greed, and they should not be adverse to renunciation, and so on and so forth. And this is what distinguishes a bhikkhu from the ascetics. So if we ever have any confusion about the bhikkhu and the ascetic, this particular discussion in the Buddha and his Dhamma is self-explanatory, explains how it is. The subpart 3 goes on comparison between the bhikshus and the brahmin. And I'm going to read them through because there are 16 verses in total, and all the verses are important. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to read them through the 16 verses, and then I'm going to gloss over some of the very important points that have come up in this beautiful subsection 3. The bhikkhu and the brahmin. Now there is a comparison between the bhikkhu and the brahmin. Is the bhikkhu the same as the brahmin? The answer to this question is also in the negative. The discussion of the subject has not been concentrated at one place. It is scattered all over, but the points of distinction can be easily summed up. So, the Baba Sahib's method, goes on collecting a lot of information, and then he collates them, he organizes them, and he presents it to us. So, the points of comparison begin here. A Brahmin is a priest. His main function is to perform certain ceremonies connected with birth, marriage, and death. So that is what the Brahmin does. What does the Brahmin do? Their main function, he's a priest. So it's clear that the bhikkhu is not a priest. Okay, very clear. These days we see that so many bhikshus pose themselves as the priests. And this is not what the original ideal is. The original ideal is different, that we are going to see. Otherwise, sometimes it's said that historically, some of the practices also came from Buddhist, the kind of Brahminical ethos and in Buddhism. Some of, not like many. So, like, if the bhikkhu is posing himself as a priest, then it becomes a different story. A Brahmin is a priest. His main function is to perform certain ceremonies connected with birth, marriage, and death. These ceremonies become necessary because of the doctrine of original sin. Now pay close attention, which requires certain ceremonies to wash it off, and because of the belief in God and in soul. See, there is no concept of original sin in Buddhism. So the overwhelming guilt that is being there in all the theistic religion, that people are born with the sin, does not exist in Buddhism. Buddhism does not talk about the original sin because The Buddha knows that people are not born out of sin. There are the biological processes. There are natural processes by which all of us are born. We are not born because we are sinful. So the doctrine of original sin has no place in the Buddha's Dhamma. And therefore, there is no scope for feeling guilty of your existence, of your birth, like the other theistic religions try to, make one feel guilty about being born. So, so once there is a concept of original sin, then of course it's followed by the ceremonies to wash it off, to clean off the original sins. And then it further leads to what is called the belief in God and in soul. For this ceremonies, a priest is necessary. So in this theistic religion, that is the role of a priest, to mediate between the God and your sinful self. In other words, to purify your sin and you access to the God. So for this ceremonies, a priest is necessary. A bhikkhu does not believe in original sin. The disciple of the Buddha is not supposed to believe in the concept of original sin, because there is nothing like original sin in God and in soul. There are therefore no ceremonies to be performed. He is therefore not a priest. So for a bhikkhu, there are no ceremonies to be performed, because he is not a mediator between some God and some, sinful soul. And these concepts, these ideas does not exist in Buddhism. So for a bhikshu, there are no ceremonies to be performed. He is therefore not a priest. So a bhikkhu is not a priest. He has no ceremonies to perform. He has nothing to clean. So this is very interesting and very important. So bear in mind, a brahmin is a priest, a bhikkhu is not a priest. The bhikkhu has no ceremonies to perform. The verse number 6, very important. A brahmin is born, a bhikkhu is made. So because you have taken birth in a certain community, you by the virtue of being born in that community, one becomes a brahmin. But a bhikkhu is not born from the womb of a mother. They are made. Very important distinction. A brahmin is born, a bhikkhu is made. A brahmin has a caste. A bhikkhu has no caste, because they don't belong to any social structure. They don't belong to any social classes. They don't belong to any of these dogmatic, functioning of the world. And therefore, they are out of it. A brahmin has a caste. A bhikkhu has no caste. Once a brahmin, always a brahmin. No sin, no crime can unmake a brahmin. So once you are born a brahmin, till you die, you are a brahmin. Whatever sins you commit, it doesn't affect you. If you kill, steal, whatever you do, you are a brahmin. But once a bhikkhu is not always a bhikkhu. A bhikkhu is made, so he can be unmade. A bhikkhu is made, so he can be unmade, if by his conduct he makes himself unworthy of remaining a bhikkhu. So very important point. No mental or moral training is necessary for being a brahmin. All that is only expected of him, is to know his religious lore. This so-called mantra, tantra, whatever. Quite different is the case of the bhikkhu. Mental and moral training is his lifeblood. So what is the lifeblood of a bhikkhu? Or for that matter, the follower of the Buddha, is the mental and moral training. A brahmin is free to acquire unlimited amount of property for himself. A bhikkhu, on the other hand, cannot. So a brahmin can amass unlimited amount of property, but a bhikkhu cannot amass any property. This is no small difference, Baba Sahib says. Property is the severest limitation upon the mental and moral independence of man, both in respect of thought and action. This is very important. What is important? Property is the severest limitation upon the mental and moral independence of man, both in respect of thought and action. It produces a conflict between the two. That is why the Brahmin is always opposed to change. See, the reason why a Brahmin is opposed to change is because, they are so much attached to the property. And when you are attached to the property, you become dependent mentally and morally on it. And it's not good for the freedom of thought and freedom of action. So for a Brahmin, it's always difficult to change. They are opposed to change. For to him, a change means loss of power and loss of wealth. A bhikkhu having no property is mentally and morally free. A bhikkhu having no property is mentally and morally free. In his case, there are no personal interests which can stand in the way of honesty and integrity. So there is no personal interest of a bhikkhu. They are Brahmins. Nonetheless, each Brahmin is an individual by himself. There is no religious organization to which he is subordinate. A Brahmin is a law unto himself. They are bound by common interests which are material. If we ever want to understand the philosophy of Brahmanism, these are very beautiful verses which are included here in the Buddha and Dhamma by Baba Sahib Ambedkar. They are Brahmins. Nonetheless, each Brahmin is an individual by himself. There is no religious organization to which he is subordinate. A Brahmin is a law unto himself. They are bound by common interests which are material. Now, 16 is, I would say, very important for us to understand. A bhikkhu, on the other hand, is always a member of the Sangha. A bhikkhu, by this particular definition, is always a member of the Sangha. It is inconceivable that there could be a bhikkhu without his being a member of the Sangha. A bhikkhu is not a law unto himself. He is subordinate to the Sangha. The Sangha is a spiritual organization. See, the bhikkhu exists for a reason. The bhikkhu doesn't exist in vacuum. A bhikkhu is not independent of the Sangha. And the Sangha is to which the bhikkhu takes his refuge. And a bhikkhu is not a law unto himself. He is subordinate to the Sangha. So Sangha, if you look at in the wider sense, the community of the people who are like devoted to creating the ideal society, the part that the logical sequence that Baba Sahib Ambedkar follows further in this particular part. A bhikkhu is not a law unto himself. He is subordinate to the Sangha. The Sangha is the spiritual organization. So this part 3 distinguishes between the bhikkhu and the Brahmin. And now we are going to the ultimate part of this part 2, the bhikkhu and the Upasaka. In the Dhamma, there is a marked distinction between the Dhamma of the bhikkhu and the Dhamma of Upasaka or the layman. Now there is a comparison between a bhikkhu and a layman or Upasaka. Let's look at the comparison. Second, the bhikkhu is bound to celibacy. Not so the Upasaka, he can marry. So the bhikshu is bound to celibacy, not so much the Upasaka, he can marry. The bhikkhu can have no home, so the bhikkhu is a homeless. He can have no family, not so the Upasaka. The Upasakas can have a home and can have a family. The bhikkhu is not to have any property, but an Upasaka can have property. The bhikkhu is forbidden from taking life, not so. The Upasaka, he may. That means they can join the armies. The bhikshu can never join the army. The Panchashilas are common to both, but to the bhikkhu, they are vows. He cannot break them without incurring penalty. To the Upasakas, they are precepts to be followed. The bhikkhu's observance of the Panchashilas is compulsory. Their observance by the Upasaka is voluntary. Why did the Blessed Lord make such a distinction? Now, why there is a distinction between the bhikshus and the Upasakas? See, all the questions that arise in our mind about Buddhism, about the Buddha's teachings, even about the Buddhist histories or the Buddhist practices are answered very logically by Baba Sahib Ambedkar. And now let's look at it. Why did the Blessed Lord make such a distinction? There must be some good reason for it. For the Blessed Lord would not do anything unless there was some good reason for it. There was always a good reason for the Lord if he did something. For the Blessed Lord would not do anything unless there was some good reason for it. The reason for this distinction is nowhere explicitly stated by the Blessed Lord. It is left to be inferred. All the same, it is necessary to know the reason for this distinction. There is no doubt that the Blessed Lord wanted through his Dhamma to lay the foundation of a kingdom of righteousness on earth. So the purpose of the Dhamma was to create the Dhamma Rajya, the kingdom of righteousness on this very earth. That is why he preached his Dhamma to all without distinction, to bhikshus as well as to laymen. So the Buddha taught the same Dhamma to everybody, isn't it? There is no, the Buddha didn't hide anything. The Buddha was, there was a very famous Pali word, Acharya Muchi, means the fist of the teacher. So some of the teachers hold some things in their fist and they never reveal to other people. The Buddha had never ever did like that. His teachings were open. He didn't hold any secret teaching in his hands. Everything was open to everybody. There is no doubt that the Blessed Lord wanted through his Dhamma to lay the foundation of a kingdom of righteousness on earth. That's why he preached his Dhamma to all without distinction, to bhikshus as well as laymen. But the Blessed Lord also knew that merely preaching the Dhamma to the common men would not result in the creation of that ideal society based on righteousness. So mere teaching the Dhamma is not enough to impress upon the common man. So what needs to be done is to create that ideal society based on righteousness. So if we look at the concept of a Sangha, which is now coming into play here, is an ideal society that is based on righteousness, that is based on Vinaya. Vinaya is principles of righteousness. They are the principles of good conduct, good governance. An ideal must be practical. So having an ideal there, which is not practicable, is not enough. An ideal must be practical and must be shown to be practicable. Then and then only people strive after it and try to realize it. To create this striving, to create that kind of a striving, it is necessary to have a picture of a society working on the basis of the ideal. So unless you create a picture of the ideal somewhere, people cannot understand what kind of ideal is being envisioned, what kind of an ideal is being taught. To create this striving, it's necessary to have a picture of a society working on the basis of the ideal and thereby proving to the common man that the ideal was not impracticable, but on the other hand, realizable. The Sangha is a model of a society realizing the Dhamma preached by the Blessed Lord. So what is the Sangha? What is the definition of the Sangha? The Sangha is a model of a society realizing the Dhamma preached by the Blessed Lord. Such a profound role of the Sangha in Buddhism. This is the reason why the Blessed Lord made this distinction between the Bhikkhu and the Upasaka. The Bhikkhu was the torch bearer of the Buddha's ideal society, and the Upasaka was to follow the Bhikkhu as closely as he could. There is also another question that requires an answer. What is the function of the Bhikkhu? Now, what is the function of the Bhikkhu? Let's look at it. Is the Bhikkhu to devote himself to self-culture or is he to serve the people and guide them? So what is the main responsibility of the Bhikshu? Are they supposed to only indulge in the self-cultivation or are they also supposed to serve the people and guide them? He must discharge both the functions. A Bhikkhu must discharge both the functions. Without self-culture, he is not fit to guide. A self-culture is very important. And Baba Ambedkar has been emphasizing again and again and again on the self-culture. And here Baba Ambedkar says that if there is no self-culture, the Bhikkhu is not fit to guide. Therefore, he must himself be a perfect, best man, righteous man, and an enlightened man. We have seen all these qualities of a perfect man, best man, righteous man, and an enlightened man in the previous discussion on the similar sections. So the self-culture is very important for a Bhikkhu and for the Buddhist or the followers of the Buddha in general, that the self-culture is important, is the heart. And he has to cultivate perfection, cultivate the qualities of a good man, best man, righteous man, and all the way up to the enlightenment itself. For this, he must practice self-culture. A Bhikkhu lives his own, but he does not retire from the world. So Bhikshu becomes a wordless, but he doesn't renounce the world. There is nothing like the renunciation of the world. You can never renunciate the world. You are always connected. When you renunciate the home, you get more and more connected with the world. That's very beautifully explained, put worded by Baba Ambedkar. A bhikkhu leaves his home. That doesn't mean that he has left the world. A bhikkhu leaves his home, but he does not retire from the world. He is not renunciating the world. He is not renunciating his worldly duties. He leaves home so that he may have the freedom and the opportunity to serve those who are attached to their homes, but whose life is full of sorrow, misery, and unhappiness, and who cannot help themselves. If we begin to grapple with the essential meaning of these words, a bhikkhu leaves his home, but he does not retire from the world. He leaves home so that he may have the freedom and the opportunity to serve those who are attached to their homes. You see, we can take this in a psychological sense as well. The particular things are left in the quest of the universal. And when the bhikshu has this universal mind, cosmopolitan mind, not attached to the parochial idea of a home, isn't it? We can look at it psychologically as well. Then once you have this freedom and an opportunity to be universal, to be free, to have this opportunity to serve those who are already having the narrow views, and because of that, they are having suffering, sorrow, misery, unhappiness, and they cannot help themselves. They need a perspective on the things. They need perspective on the life. So last two verses, compassion, which is the essence of the Dhamma, requires that everyone shall love and serve. The Buddha's Dhamma, the essence of the Buddha's Dhamma is compassion. Compassion is the essence of the Dhamma, requires that everyone shall love and serve, and the bhikkhu is not exempt from it. A bhikkhu who is indifferent to the woes, who is of mankind, however perfect in self-culture, is not at all a bhikkhu. He may be something else, but he is not a bhikkhu. See, rereading the Buddha and his Dhamma, isn't it? Going through the sentences, the paragraphs, the parts, the subparts, the books, and the entirety of the books opens up many domains of understanding and practices and cultivation. One is thrilled when one reads the Buddha and his Dhamma as to how the clarity is brought by Baba Ambedkar in every page of the Buddha and his Dhamma. Every single page speaks of the mind of Baba Ambedkar. And if you look at the ideal of Baba Ambedkar himself as a follower of the Buddha, his mind can be seen in the pages of the Buddha and his Dhamma. So for the today's class, we have this wonderful comparison of the bhikkhu and the ascetic, the bhikshu and a brahmin, the bhikshu and the upasaka. But this is not just mere comparison. It also goes deeper into what kind of the life we can all live. In other words, how we can try to be our own bhikshus. How to bring in that ideal of the bhikshu in our own lives. What is the sangha? How to understand the sangha? Then how to understand the role of the bhikshu. So you see, the ultimate aim of the Buddha's Dhamma is to Bahujan Hitai, Bahujan Sukhai. And the Buddha says, strive hard. For what? Lokanukampai. By vibrating together with the world. The Buddha's Dhamma or the bhikshus are not the renunciator of the world. They don't renunciate the world. They leave their home so that they can be free to serve more. So you see, these paragraphs also important for us to have this clarity, and today's discussion makes it clear that the what is called the Bahujan Hitai, Bahujan Sukhai. For this you need to create a picture of it, a model of it, and that model of it or the picture of that ideal community or a society is the ideal of the Sangha. that Sangha needs the people who belongs to that Sangha, and the people that belongs to that Sangha are ultimately subordinate to the Sangha. And, this Bhikshu has these duties to discharge, and therefore, everything connects together with our lives and the kind of situation we find ourselves into. So what I will do, I will stop here for today, and then we will open up the class for any further questions or clarifications. So anything on anybody's mind? But these sections are very fairly clear, and they have so much into them that we can begin to find a lot of clarity in these sections of the Buddha and his Dhamma. So anyone has any comments, or we should end the class here? Vidya, Richa, Sunil, Rahul, anything on your minds, or should we end the class here? Vidya?
Yeah, I would like to say something.
Yeah, please.
In the first part where we discussed regarding the is a Bhikkhu ascetic. So
Yeah.
here I sense that Baba Sahib actually trying to point out how the mind of Bhikkhu has to be. It should not be towards the austerity. It should follow. So it's actually he's trying to say what as a Bhikkhu he should contemplate. And while communicating duties of Bhikkhu, these are not an easy task to live a life of Bhikkhu, because it's certainly somewhere compared to Upasaka, it's still a austerous life. It's not an easy life. But in that life also, because while rejecting austerity, it doesn't mean that a different kind of austerity, which actually which has a craving for gaining something from the people, is being rejected. It's not the austerity which helps in training, which helps in creating a society. Because the Baba Sahib did a lot of hard work to create a revolution. That hard work is certainly did it, and that's not been rejected here. That's what I can sense it from the discussion.
That's very true. You had a point. You have a point, and I think that's right. Okay, I think if there are no any comments, then we will end our class here today and see you next week.